This is the story of Ezra Combs, the barefoot man of Black Mountain. He vanished in 1933.
He vanished barefoot into the mountains for 60 years after hunting. 21 deputies who hanged his son. They found him in 2008, a man whose existence had become legend, whose footprints had been tracked for 6 decades without ever leading to the tracker's quarry. He was 97 years old, had lived alone in the wilderness longer than most people live at all, had survived without shoes for 60 years because shoes left tracks and tracks led hunters to their prey. The barefoot man of Pine Mountain had killed 21 deputies in the winter of 1948, had vanished into terrain that should have been impassable, and had watched from ridges as the world forgot he had ever existed. This is the true story of the longest disappearance in American criminal history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coal fields, during the desperate years following the Second World War, when returning veterans discovered that the country they had fought for had no place for men whose only skills were survival and violence. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the nation's founding, who measured justice not by what courts decided, but by what blood demanded. You see, in Harlan County during the years of our story, a place so violent it had earned the nickname Bloody Harlan, the coal companies ruled with authority that no government could challenge. The deputies who enforced company wore badges purchased with company money, served warrants issued by company judges, broke families whose independence interfered with profits that the operators intended to extract. A man who defied the companies could find himself facing consequences that the civilized world pretended did not exist within American borders. The man at the center of our story was born Jeremiah Ezekiel Combs in 1911, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where his family had lived since 1798. He had survived the Depression as a young man, had fought across the Pacific during the war, had returned to the mountains that had always been his home, with skills and experiences that he hoped to never use again. He was 37 years old in the winter of 1948, a man whose quiet exterior concealed capabilities that few people suspected and that circumstances would soon reveal. That's right. Jeremiah Combs stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, had dark hair that showed no gray despite the horrors he had witnessed, possessed eyes that were the pale blue of winter sky and that seemed to see distances that others could not perceive. His body was lean and hard from years of military service and from the labor that mountain farming required. His feet were calloused from a childhood spent largely barefoot, from summers when shoes were luxuries that poor families could not afford, from years of training his soles to endure terrain that would have crippled men whose feet had always been protected. He had been a Marine, had island-hopped across the Pacific in some of the bloodiest fighting the world had ever seen. He had survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Iwo Jima, had killed more men than he could count, had learned to move through jungle and rock without leaving traces that enemies could follow. The war had taught him things about survival and killing that peacetime did not require him to remember, but the skills remained waiting for circumstances that would justify their use. His son was named Thomas, 18 years old in the winter of 1948, a boy who had grown to manhood while his father fought overseas, who had become the man of the household during years when his father's return was never certain. Thomas had his father's build and his mother's gentle nature, stood 6 feet tall at 18, possessed a smile that made people trust him, and a voice that carried when he spoke at union meetings, where men discussed whether the conditions in the mines could be changed. Thomas had become involved in labor organizing during the years of his father's absence, had joined older men in efforts to improve conditions that killed miners with regularity that the companies considered acceptable. He had spoken at meetings, had distributed materials, had become known to the company officials whose interests required that such organizing be stopped. His youth and his father's military service had protected him for a time, but that protection had limits that the winter of 1948 would reveal. Jeremiah's wife was named Sarah, 40 years old in 1948, a woman whose beauty had not diminished despite 2 decades of mountain labor, whose love for her husband and son formed the foundation of everything the family had built. She had kept the farm running during the war years, had raised Thomas to be the man his father would be proud of, had welcomed Jeremiah home with joy that the separations of war had not diminished. The trouble that would destroy this family began with Thomas's involvement in a strike that had shut down 3 mines in Harlan County during the autumn of 1948. The strike had been effective, too effective for the companies to tolerate. The operators had determined that an example needed to be made, that the organizers needed to be broken in ways that would discourage any future attempts at collective action. The sheriff of Harlan County was a man named Vernon Crawford, whose position had been purchased by the coal companies specifically to address problems like Thomas Combs. Crawford had developed a reputation for methods that exceeded what legitimate law enforcement would employ, had broken other families through violence that courts refused to examine and that newspapers declined to report. The raid came on the night of December 15, 1948. Crawford led 21 deputies up the hollow with rope that had been prepared for purposes that legitimate law enforcement would never sanction. They came for Thomas, came with the confidence of men who believed their authority was absolute and their actions beyond consequence. Jeremiah was not home when the deputies arrived. He had traveled to Lexington 3 days before to purchase equipment that the farm required, a trip that the company had known about because informants monitored every movement the family made. The timing of the raid had been calculated to ensure his absence, to prevent complications that a combat veteran might have created. Sarah tried to protect her son when the deputies arrived, tried to block the door of the cabin where Thomas had been sleeping, tried to prevent what she understood was about to happen. The deputies struck her aside with force that produced injuries she would carry for the remainder of her life, forced their way into the cabin, dragged Thomas from the bed where he had been sleeping. "This is what happens to union organizers," Crawford announced as the deputies bound Thomas's hands behind his back. "This is what happens to troublemakers who think they can challenge the natural order of things. Let this boy serve as an example to anyone else who might be considering similar foolishness." They took Thomas to a clearing half a mile from the cabin, a location that Crawford had selected weeks before for purposes that had nothing to do with legal process. A tree stood in the center of the clearing, an oak whose branches had witnessed Harlan County's history since before the Revolution. One branch extended horizontally at a height that was perfect for Crawford's purposes, had been selected specifically because of that perfection. The deputies threw a rope over the branch while Thomas watched, while understanding of what was about to happen replaced confusion in his eyes. He did not beg. The son of Jeremiah Combs would not give these men the satisfaction of hearing him beg. He stood straight, despite the hands that held him, met Crawford's eyes with defiance that his situation should not have permitted. "My father will find you," Thomas said, his voice steady despite what he knew was coming. "Every man here tonight. My father will find you all." Crawford laughed. "Your father is 100 miles away, boy, and by the time he returns, you'll be cold in the ground, and there won't be a witness alive who'll say what happened here tonight." The noose was placed around Thomas's neck, hemp rope that had been prepared specifically for this purpose, tied in a knot that would tighten but would not provide the quick death that a properly constructed hangman's knot would have ensured. Crawford had learned that slow deaths produced more effective examples than quick ones, that strangulation demonstrated consequences more thoroughly than broken necks. Thomas felt the rough hemp against his skin, felt the weight of the rope that would end his life. He did not close his eyes. He kept them open, fixed on Crawford, refused to give the sheriff the satisfaction of seeing fear that his situation should have produced. "Any last words?" Crawford asked, his voice carrying mockery that his position permitted. "Any message for your father when he returns?" "Tell him I didn't beg," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the rope around his neck. "Tell him I stood straight. Tell him I was a Combs until the end." They did not use a drop that would have broken his neck. They simply hoisted him, pulled the rope until his feet left the ground, tied off the end while Thomas kicked and struggled and fought for breath that the rope was slowly denying him. The first minute was disbelief. Thomas's body refused to accept what was happening, continued functioning as though breath would return at any moment. His legs kicked with strength that his youth provided, his hands strained against bonds that would not yield. His eyes remained open and fixed on the men who had condemned him. The second and third minutes were struggle. His body understood now that air was not coming, that the pressure around his throat was not releasing, that survival required effort that exceeded anything normal existence demanded. His face began to change color, red suffusing features that had been pale in the moonlight, as blood that could not return to his heart accumulated in tissues that the rope was compressing. The 4th and 5th minutes were desperation. His kicks became more frantic, less coordinated, as oxygen deprivation began affecting muscles that required it to function. Sounds emerged from his throat. Not words, but sounds that the compression permitted, gurgles and gasps that the deputies would remember in nightmares for whatever remained of their lives. The 6th and 7th minutes were weakening. His body was failing now, systems shutting down as oxygen that they required was denied. His kicks slowed, became less forceful, as muscles that had been strong began to surrender to chemistry that strength could not overcome. His face had progressed from red to purple, from purple toward blue, as cyanosis claimed features that had been handsome hours before. The 8th and 9th minutes were surrender. His body had stopped fighting now, hung with only occasional twitches that represented the final protests of a nervous system that was dying. His eyes remained open but had lost focus, stared at nothing that the living could perceive, had begun the transition from awareness to absence that death would soon complete. The 10th minute was stillness. The twitches had stopped. The body hung motionless, swaying slightly in the winter wind that moved through the clearing. The only movement was the rope, creaking against the branch that supported weight that would soon be lowered. The 11th minute was confirmation. Crawford watched a pocket watch that he had produced specifically for this purpose, counted seconds that accumulated into a minute that confirmed death had occurred. He wanted to be certain. He wanted the full 11 minutes to be completed before he ordered the body cut down. The strangulation took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Thomas's body fought for survival that the rope would not permit, during which his face changed colors that the moonlight revealed, during which sounds emerged from his throat that the deputies would remember in nightmares for whatever remained of their lives. Sarah had followed the deputies to the clearing, had been held back by men whose strength exceeded anything she could resist. She watched her son die, watched 11 minutes of strangulation that legitimate execution would never have permitted, screamed his name until her voice gave out, and screaming became impossible. "Thomas, Tommy, no, please God, no! No!" Her screams carried across the hollow to cabins, where other families heard and understood what was happening, but could not intervene. Her screams echoed off ridges that had witnessed Combs' tragedies since 1798. Her screams continued until Thomas stopped struggling, until his body hung still, until the 11 minutes had ended and death had finally claimed him. She collapsed when it was over, fell to the ground beneath the tree where her son's body swayed in the winter wind. The deputies who had held her released their grip, stepped back from a mother whose grief exceeded anything their cruelty had anticipated. She lay in the snow beneath her son's body, reached up toward feet that she could not touch, spoke words that emerged as whispers because her voice had been destroyed. "My baby. My boy. Thomas, wake up, please wake up. Mama's here, baby, please wake up." The deputies cut Thomas down after an hour, left his body in the clearing where Sarah could retrieve it, departed believing that the example they had made would discourage any future organizing for years to come. They did not bother to conceal what they had done. Concealment would have defeated the purpose of the example. Jeremiah returned from Lexington 2 days later, returned to a wife whose injuries told part of the story and whose silence told the rest. He found Thomas buried on a ridge overlooking the hollow, found a grave that Sarah had dug herself because she could not bear to leave her son's body in the clearing where he had died. Sarah told him everything, the names of the deputies, the method of the killing, the 11 minutes of strangulation that she had been forced to witness. She told him about Thomas's final words, about the promise his son had made that his father would find every man responsible. Jeremiah stood at Thomas's grave until darkness came, stood without speaking, while Sarah waited in the cabin for his return. When he finally came inside, his face had changed into something that Sarah had never seen during their 20 years of marriage, something that the war had created and that peacetime had concealed. "I'm going to kill them all," he said, his voice carrying the flatness of someone for whom emotion had been replaced by purpose. Every man who was there that night, Every man who touched the rope or held you back or watched while our son strangled for 11 minutes, they will all die, Sarah. They will die understanding what they did." Sarah did not try to dissuade him. She had watched her son die. She wanted the men responsible to experience consequences that the legal system would never provide. "There's something else," Jeremiah said. "When it's done, I'm going into the mountains. I won't be coming back. If I stay, they'll hunt me, and they'll use you to find me. If I disappear completely, they can't use you because you won't know where I am." Sarah began to weep, understanding that she was losing her husband as well as her son, that the family she had built was ending regardless of how the vengeance unfolded. "I'll watch," Jeremiah continued, "from the ridges. I'll watch you live your life, watch you grow old, watch over you until one of us dies. But I can't come back. You understand why I can't come back?" Sarah understood. She wept, but she understood. Jeremiah spent 2 weeks preparing for what he intended to do. He gathered supplies from caches that his father had established decades before, accumulated weapons and equipment that his campaign would require. He studied the deputies who had participated in Thomas's murder, learned their routines and their vulnerabilities through observation that no one detected. And he began toughening his feet for what would follow. He walked barefoot across terrain that would have crippled anyone whose souls were not prepared, rebuilt calluses that years of wearing boots had diminished. He understood that shoes left distinctive tracks, that barefoot prints were harder to follow and easier to disguise. If he was going to disappear for the rest of his life, he needed to leave no traces that trackers could follow. The first killing occurred on January 3, 1949, 19 days after Thomas's death. A deputy named Dale Tackett was found hanging from a tree on his own property, a rope around his neck identical to the rope that had been used on Thomas. Jeremiah had watched Tackett for days, had learned his routines and his vulnerabilities, had identified the moment when the deputy would be most exposed. Tackett lived alone on a small farm outside of Harlan, a location he believed was safe because it was distant from Combs' territory, and because he kept dogs that would alert him to any approach. The dogs did not alert him to Jeremiah's approach. The skills that had allowed Jeremiah to infiltrate Japanese positions in the Pacific allowed him to neutralize the dogs without sound, to approach the cabin without any warning that his target might have detected. He took Tackett from his own bed, subdued him with techniques that the Marines had taught him, transported him to a tree that stood at the edge of Tackett's property. The tree had a branch that extended horizontally at the proper height, had been selected specifically because of its similarity to the tree where Thomas had died. "Do you remember Thomas Combs?" Jeremiah asked as he positioned the rope. 18 years old. You helped hoist him. You pulled the rope while he kicked. Do you remember? Tackett tried to speak, tried to beg, tried to offer explanations that might delay what was clearly coming. Jeremiah had no interest in his words. The strangulation had taken approximately 11 minutes, the same duration that Thomas had suffered. Jeremiah had timed it precisely, had watched his pocket watch as Tackett experienced exactly what Thomas had experienced. He had counted every minute, had ensured that the symmetry between crime and punishment was exact. On a piece of paper pinned to his chest were the words, "For Thomas Combs, 1 of 21. The investigation that followed produced nothing useful. Footprints at the scene were barefoot, a detail that confused investigators who assumed no one would commit murder without shoes in December in Kentucky. The tracks led into forest and disappeared on rocky ground that retained no impressions. Dogs lost the scent within a quarter mile, found no trail that led to anything that might have been a destination. The second killing came 4 days later, claiming Robert Lawson, another deputy who had participated in the hanging. Lawson had fled to a cousin's home in Bell County when he learned of Tackett's death, had believed that distance and family would provide protection that solitude had not. Jeremiah tracked him with skills that the Pacific War had honed, found him despite precautions that should have concealed his location, reached him before any alarm could be raised. Lawson's death matched Tackett's exactly. Hanging, 11 minutes of strangulation, the same message pinned to his chest. For Thomas Combs, 2 of 21. The barefoot tracks led into forest and vanished on stone, left no trail that any tracker could follow. That's right, Jeremiah was killing the deputies using the same method they had used on his son, was ensuring that each experienced the same 11 minutes of strangulation that Thomas had endured. The pattern that would define the winter of 1949 had been established. The third and fourth killings came during the second week of January, taking deputies who had attempted to flee when they understood what was happening. William Mitchell had made it as far as Knoxville, Tennessee, had believed that crossing state lines would provide protection that Kentucky could not. Jeremiah followed him, tracked him through a city that should have provided anonymity, found him in a boarding house where he had registered under a false name. Mitchell's death occurred in a warehouse district where screams would not be heard, where an 11-minute hanging could be conducted without interruption. James Porter had fled to Virginia, had hidden with relatives in Wise County who had promised to protect him. The relatives could not protect him. Jeremiah reached him despite their vigilance, took him from a cabin that family members had believed was secure, introduced him to a rope that would occupy the final 11 minutes of his life. The terror that spread through the sheriff's department was unlike anything Harlan County had experienced since the mine wars of the previous decades. Deputies who had participated in Thomas's hanging understood that they were being hunted, that something was moving through the winter forest with patience that their precautions could not defeat. They understood that the hunter was barefoot, that his tracks vanished on stone, that he could reach them regardless of where they fled. The 5th through 10th deputies died during the third week of January, each death following the same pattern, each body found hanging with the same message attached. The 11th minute strangulation became Jeremiah's signature, a duration that precisely matched what his son had experienced, a symmetry that ensured every deputy understood exactly why he was dying. Crawford ordered his remaining deputies to travel in groups, to maintain constant communication, to fortify their positions against an enemy whose capabilities exceeded anything they had anticipated. He brought in additional men from adjacent counties, created a force that should have been able to protect themselves from any individual attacker. The precautions proved inadequate. Jeremiah reached them anyway, took them one by one from groups that should have provided protection, demonstrated that numbers provided no security against someone whose skills exceeded anything they could counter. He developed techniques that isolated individuals from groups, that created opportunities where vigilance had seemed to provide none. The 11th through 15th deputies died during the fourth week of January, each death requiring more elaborate methods to achieve as the survivors became more cautious. Jeremiah adapted, developed approaches that exploited the specific vulnerabilities of each target, demonstrated patience that his prey could not match. He waited for opportunities rather than forcing them, allowed time to create openings that haste would have prevented. Some deputies fled the county, believing that distance would provide protection. Jeremiah followed them to Virginia, to Tennessee, to West Virginia, tracked them across state lines with persistence that their flight could not escape. The 16th deputy died in Wise County, Virginia. The 17th died in Johnson City, Tennessee. The 18th died in McDowell County, West Virginia. Each death matched the pattern. Each body found hanging with the same message attached. The 19th and 20th deputies were found on February 15th, their bodies hanging from trees outside the building, where Crawford had established his headquarters. They had been taken from positions directly outside the sheriff's safe house, had been killed within 100 yards of where Crawford himself was hiding. The message was clear: no location was secure, no protection was adequate. Crawford attempted to flee on February 20th, arranged transportation that he believed was secret, planned a route that would take him far from Kentucky and the vengeance that had claimed 20 of his men. He did not understand that Jeremiah had been waiting for exactly this attempt. The confrontation occurred on a mountain road, where the terrain forced vehicles to slow, where the forest pressed close on both sides. Crawford's vehicle was stopped by debris that blocked the road, debris that had been positioned by hands that Crawford never saw. Then Jeremiah emerged from the forest, a rope coiled in his hands, his feet bare despite the February cold. Crawford tried to run, tried to flee into forest that he believed would provide escape. He did not understand that he was running into terrain that Jeremiah knew better than anyone alive. That flight was taking him further from help rather than closer to it. Jeremiah caught Crawford within a quarter mile, brought him down with techniques that the Marines had taught him, secured him with efficiency that Crawford's struggles could not defeat. "Do you remember my son?" Jeremiah asked, his voice carrying the flatness that had replaced emotion. "Thomas Combs, 18 years old. You hanged him for 11 minutes while his mother watched. Do you remember?" Crawford tried to speak, to offer explanations or bargains that might delay what was clearly coming. He blamed the company, claimed he had been following orders, insisted that Thomas's death had not been his idea. "You ordered it," Jeremiah replied. "You selected the tree. You tied the knot that wouldn't break his neck. You watched for 11 minutes while my son strangled. You told his mother this was what happened to troublemakers. Now you experience what Thomas experienced." What Jeremiah did to Crawford matched exactly what Crawford had done to Thomas. The rope was thrown over a branch. The noose was placed around Crawford's neck. The hoisting was slow, did not provide the drop that would have broken his neck. 11 minutes, Jeremiah said as Crawford's feet left the ground. "That's how long Thomas lasted. That's how long you'll last. I'm going to watch just like you watched. I'm going to count the minutes just like my wife counted the minutes while she watched our son die." Crawford's death took 11 minutes and 40 seconds, slightly longer than Thomas's death, because Crawford was larger and stronger, and his body fought harder for survival. Jeremiah watched every second, counted every minute, ensured that the symmetry between crime and punishment was as precise as human hands could make it. When it was over, Jeremiah pinned the final message to Crawford's chest. "Vernon Crawford, he hanged my son, 21 of 21, for Thomas." 21 deputies killed in 63 days by a man who tracked them across 4 states, who killed each one using the method that had been used on his son, who left barefoot tracks that led into wilderness and vanished into stone. And then Jeremiah Combs disappeared. He walked into the Pine Mountain wilderness barefoot on the night of February 20th, 1949, and he did not emerge for 60 years. The manhunt that followed was the most intensive in Kentucky history, deployed resources that exceeded anything previously assembled for a single fugitive. Dogs lost his scent on rocky ground. Trackers lost his barefoot prints on stone that retained no impressions. Aircraft saw nothing in forest that hid everything beneath its canopy. The search continued for months, then years, then decades. Jeremiah Combs became a legend, a ghost story that Harlan County told its children, a warning about what happened to men who pushed mountain people too far. The authorities eventually concluded that he had died in the wilderness within months of his disappearance, that the winter of 1949 had killed him as surely as his campaign had killed the deputies. But Jeremiah Combs had not died. He had simply become part of the mountain itself. He found a location that no search would discover, a cave system deep within Pine Mountain that his grandfather had shown him when he was a boy. The caves extended into the mountain for nearly 2 miles, contained chambers that had been used by his family during the Civil War, that had sheltered ancestors from both armies that had swept through these mountains. The entrance was concealed by rock formations that appeared impassable, required knowledge that only those who had been shown could possess. He made his home in chambers that previous generations had improved, expanded the habitation over decades of work, that transformed refuge into something approaching permanence. The main chamber he occupied was approximately 30 feet across, had a ceiling high enough to stand without stooping, received light from a crack in the rock above that served as both illumination and ventilation. Previous generations had improved the space, had built a stone platform for sleeping that raised occupants above the cold floor, had constructed shelves from flat rocks that provided storage for supplies and provisions. He built upon what his ancestors had created, added improvements that his circumstances required. He constructed a fire pit that vented through natural fissures in the rock, that allowed cooking and heating without producing smoke that might be visible from any distance. He built storage spaces for the food he would need to survive winters that could last 5 months. He created a living space that was simple but adequate, that sustained existence for decades that stretched before him. He built structures that made long-term habitation possible, established systems for survival that required no contact with the world he had abandoned. He constructed cisterns that collected water from seepage through the limestone above, stored it in containers he fashioned from materials the forest provided. He built a smokehouse for preserving meat, a root cellar dug into the cave floor for storing vegetables through winter, storage spaces for the supplies that accumulation would require. He never wore shoes again. The calluses he developed over 60 years made his feet harder than leather, allowed him to walk on stone and through snow without the protection that others required. His barefoot existence became so natural that shoes would have felt like prisons on feet that had learned to read terrain through direct contact. The first winter was a test that nearly killed him. The cold penetrated even his well-prepared caves, found him in chambers that should have been secure. His body, still adjusting to conditions that decades would make normal, struggled against temperatures that his preparations had not fully anticipated. He came close to dying multiple times during those months, from cold and from mistakes that experience would later prevent. But spring came eventually, as spring always does, and with it came determination that the winter had tested but had not broken. He improved his preparations, sealed gaps that the winter had revealed, accumulated stores that would sustain him through the next cold season. Each subsequent year brought refinements that made survival easier, that transformed existence from struggle into routine. He established gardens in clearings that the caves accessed, developed techniques for hunting and gathering that sustained him through seasons that varied in their generosity. The gardens became rituals that connected him to the land in ways that his previous life had not permitted. He grew potatoes and beans and squash, varieties that his grandfather had cultivated, seeds that carried connections to generations stretching back to the family's arrival in these mountains. The hunting and trapping that provided protein became routine over years of practice. He learned the patterns of deer and turkey that populated the ridges around his caves, developed techniques for taking them that required neither firearms whose sound might attract attention, nor traps whose presence might be discovered by searchers who still occasionally passed through the area. He constructed snares and deadfalls that captured game while he attended to other tasks, checked them daily during seasons when they were active. He adapted to the mountain's rhythms, became so attuned to its patterns that he could sense approaching weather and approaching danger with equal accuracy. He knew when storms were coming by the behavior of birds and the feel of the air. He knew when humans were approaching by sounds that did not belong to the forest's normal symphony. The mountain became an extension of his senses, provided warnings that his solitary existence required, and he watched. As he had promised Sarah, he watched. He found vantage points that overlooked the hollow where he had lived, positions from which he could observe without being observed. The journey to these vantage points took hours, required routes that avoided any chance of detection. But he made it regularly, regardless of weather or season. He developed a schedule that brought him to observation points, on days when he knew Sarah would be visible, when routine would place her in locations where his distant eyes could confirm that she was well. He watched Sarah age through decades that he could not share with her, watched her hair turn white and her steps slow and her body bend with years that accumulated without him beside her. He watched her work the garden that had once been theirs together, watched her tend the livestock that had once been their shared responsibility, watched her live a life that his absence had made solitary, despite neighbors who checked on her regularly. He watched her tend Thomas's grave every Sunday, watched her speak words that distance prevented him from hearing, watched her maintain a vigil that he could observe but could not join. She would spend hours at the grave, would sit on a stone that she had positioned there for exactly this purpose, would speak to a son who had been in the ground for years that accumulated into decades. He watched her decline as age claimed the strength she had once possessed. He watched her become frail, watched her movements slow, watched her require assistance for tasks she had once performed alone. He watched neighbors begin to visit more frequently, watched family members from distant counties arrive to help with labor that her body could no longer perform. He watched and could not help, watched and could not comfort, watched and could not hold the woman he had loved since they were both young. He watched her die in 1983, watched from a ridge as the community gathered to bury her beside the son she had mourned for 35 years. He watched the funeral from a distance that his hiding required, watched people speak words that he could not hear, watched the box that contained his wife lowered into ground, that would hold her until his own burial joined them. He crept to her grave that night, knelt beside the woman he had loved for over 40 years, spoke words that only the dead could hear. "I kept my promise," he told her. "I watched over you. I never stopped watching. I'm sorry I couldn't be beside you at the end. I'm sorry for all the years we lost. But I kept my promise, Sarah. I killed them all and I watched over you, and now you're with Thomas and you're not alone anymore." He continued living after Sarah's death, continued his existence in the caves that had become the only home he remembered. The solitude that had been bearable while Sarah lived became heavier without her. But habits of survival that 6 decades had established carried him through grief that might otherwise have ended his existence. He created rituals that gave structure to days that might otherwise have been formless. He rose with the light that filtered through the crack in his ceiling, performed tasks in sequences that became sacred through repetition. He visited Sarah's grave when security permitted, spoke to her as he had spoken to Thomas, maintained relationships that death had interrupted but had not ended. He kept journals throughout his isolation, documented his days and thoughts in notebooks he made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals served multiple purposes. They provided activity that filled hours that might otherwise have been empty. They created records that would eventually explain what had happened and why. And they maintained connections to language and thought that pure solitude might otherwise have eroded. The journals contained confessions that he intended to survive him, truths that he believed the world should eventually know. "I killed 21 men," he wrote in an entry from 1995. "I killed them because they hanged my son for 11 minutes while his mother watched. I killed them using the same method they used on Thomas, made each one experience the same 11 minutes of strangulation that my boy experienced. I do not regret what I did. I would do it again. Their father who does not answer what was done to his son is no father at all." He wrote about Thomas constantly, preserved memories through descriptions that exceeded what photographs could have captured. He wrote about teaching Thomas to hunt, about watching him grow from boy to man, about the pride he had felt when Thomas had spoken at union meetings with a voice that carried like his father's. He kept Thomas alive in ways that memory alone could not accomplish. By the 2000s, Jeremiah was in his 90s, had survived alone in the wilderness for nearly 6 decades, had maintained his existence through capabilities that most people would have found impossible. His body had aged, had slowed, had begun to fail in ways that decades of mountain living had delayed but could not prevent. He knew that his time was ending. He prepared for death with the same methodical precision he had applied to everything else, ensured that his journals would be found, that the truth he had preserved would eventually reach the world. Jeremiah Combs did not die alone in his cave. He walked out of the wilderness on February 20th, 2008, exactly 60 years after he had walked in. He was 97 years old, barefoot despite the February cold, barely recognizable as the man whose photograph had hung in cold case files for 6 decades. He walked into the town of Harlan, approached the sheriff's office that had once been commanded by Vernon Crawford, and surrendered himself to authorities who had no idea who he was or what he was confessing to. "My name is Jeremiah Combs," he told the deputies who received him, his voice carrying clarity that his appearance seemed to contradict. "In 1948, Vernon Crawford and his men hanged my son Thomas. I killed Crawford and every deputy who participated. I've been living in Pine Mountain ever since. I'm ready now. I've lived long enough." The confession that followed was the most detailed in Kentucky criminal history. Jeremiah described every killing, every method, every location where the deaths had occurred. He explained the 11-minute duration, explained the barefoot tracking that had allowed him to disappear, explained the 60 years of watching that had followed. He was not prosecuted. The statute of limitations had expired decades before. The witnesses were all dead, and the defendant was 97 years old, with a life expectancy measured in months. The prosecutor concluded that prosecution would serve no purpose except to punish a man who had already spent 60 years in isolation that exceeded anything any prison could have imposed. Jeremiah died on March 15, 2008, 23 days after his emergence from the wilderness. He died in a hospital bed, surrounded by descendants of siblings he had not seen in 60 years, reconciled with a world he had abandoned when that world had killed his son. He was buried beside Sarah and Thomas, in graves that had waited 60 years for him to join them. The inscription on his stone reads, Jeremiah Ezekiel Combs, 1911-2008. They hanged his son. He answered. He watched for 60 years. Together again at last. Beside him, the stones that had marked the other graves. Sarah Combs, 1908-1983, beloved wife and mother. She waited. Thomas Combs, 1930-1948, beloved son, 18 years old, 11 minutes. The songs that emerged from the Barefoot Man's story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of an 18-year-old hanged for 11 minutes and the determination of a father who lived barefoot in the wilderness for 60 years. The first verse described Thomas before the hanging, the union organizer whose voice had carried at meetings, the son whose father had been proud of the man he was becoming. The melody was strong and hopeful, suggesting futures that should have been allowed to unfold. The second verse described the hanging, 11 minutes of strangulation, while a mother watched and screamed, the boy whose last words were a promise that his father would find them all. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described Jeremiah's return and transformation, the combat veteran, who became something else when he learned what had been done to his son. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting determination that nothing could prevent. The fourth verse described the campaign, 21 deputies dying by the same method they had used on Thomas, each experiencing the same 11 minutes, the barefoot tracks that vanished into stone. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting justice that age could not prevent. The fifth verse described the 60 years of hiding, the barefoot man who watched his wife age and die from ridges she never knew he occupied, the journals that documented decades of solitude. The melody softened, became almost peaceful, suggesting love that distance could not diminish. The final verse described the emergence and the confession, the 97-year-old who walked out of the wilderness to tell the truth before death claimed him. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, however extreme, eventually receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Jeremiah rests beside the family he avenged and watched over? To read the inscriptions that speak of hanging and watching and 60 years of barefoot solitude? Would you walk through the caves where he survived for 6 decades? Would you try to understand how love could sustain a life that had sacrificed everything except memory and vigilance? The journey to Harlan County is easier now than it was in 1948, the roads paved, and the world more connected than it was when deputies hanged an 18-year-old for organizing miners to demand better conditions. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of fathers and sons rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of the man who vanished barefoot into the mountains for 60 years after hunting 21 deputies who hanged his son. A story of love that became fury, that became 6 decades of solitude, that ended only when an old man walked out of the wilderness to confess before death could claim him. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Jeremiah Combs killed 21 deputies who had hanged his 18-year-old son for 11 minutes, then disappeared barefoot into the mountains for 60 years, watching over his wife until her death, and finally emerging at 97 to confess everything. What about you? If deputies hanged your son for 11 minutes while your wife watched, could you kill 21 men using the same method? Could you live barefoot in caves for 60 years, watching your wife age and die from distances she never knew you occupied? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some fathers love their sons so completely that 60 years of barefoot solitude is merely the space between murder and reunion. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the fathers who call them home.